We can now analyze the clearance of each of the paths above the terrain by using an analysis function which is in Path Designer. We first, however, have to decide what band each of the paths is going to use, because the clearance must be basically below the Fresnel zone. So under the Utilities menu in Path Designer, we have a form which we can bring up, which will allow us to set the requirements above ground before we hit the lower end of the clearance for the Fresnel zone. So we select the path suitability criteria under Utilities menu, and it brings up the suitability criteria form. On the left side of the form is the preliminary path analysis, which is what we're using right now. The right hand side, once we've assigned purpose to the paths and the paths have been analyzed, we look only at Fresnel zone and K-factor values specific to the purpose. We'll do that later. At the present, we work on the left hand side under preliminary paths. At the top we have the ideal clearance, which is shown as 100 feet. Basically, preliminary paths are unsurveyed, so we don't know what's there. So we make allowance above the terrain value, in this case of 100 feet, up until the lower end of the Fresnel zone, the first Fresnel zone, 100% first Fresnel zone. Any path that has that adequate amount of clearance, or that amount of clearance, is deemed to be an ideally clear path, so that it gets tagged as ideal. Any path that has a clearance between the lower end of the Fresnel zone and the terrain, in this case of 65 feet, is declared to be a marginal path, something we may want to consider. Anything below 65 feet, meaning the lower end of the Fresnel zone to the terrain value is less than 65 feet, is considered to be inadequate. And all of these are calculated for the K-factor that's set. Normally it's at 4/3. The little table on the left with the band and the range helps the tool as a preliminary guideline to assign the band. So each of the paths is looked at in terms of its length, and the band is assigned when we analyze. This table, as well as the clearance criteria as above, can all be edited. We can add bands, delete bands, or change values. So I'll just continue. I'll close this form. Now, to analyze with all of the paths selected as they are, we go to the Network menu, and we're going to pull down the function to analyze paths and set band. So you can see it says analyze path clearance and assign most suitable band for selected paths. This is using the table that I just showed you with the range for each of the bands. So click on continue. What it's doing now is it's going to go through each of the paths and extract the coordinates from each of the sites for each of the paths, figure out the path profile from the DEMS terrain file. The DEMS terrain file is a terrain file which is associated with path loss, is set up within path loss, and Path Designer goes directly to that file or to those files. It extracts all the data points, it works out that clearance value, and then makes a judgment as to whether or not it has adequate clearance to be declared ideal, marginal, or if not, then inadequate. It also finds the worst clearance point, so it might be at a particular point down the path which is the worst clearance, and it will tabulate that value under the clearance parameter in the window, which you'll see in a minute. It's doing this presently without any PL4 files, so you'll see that the clearance value shows no PL4 as well as the value in feet. Were there path loss files, PL4 files in our directory, then it would take the values of the terrain from there, including the obstructions. This is because surveyed paths will have obstructions added to the terrain points, and it'll give us a more accurate clearance analysis. As soon as it finishes, we'll look at the listing in the form. Okay, so now you can see under the suitability column that we have marginal, ideal, inadequate for the various paths, and to the right of that, under the clearance column, it says no PL4 and then the clearance in feet. So for example, the second one says ideal clearance, and it's showing 102 feet, and that's because our clearance requirement was 100 feet to be considered ideal. Inadequate, for example, is going to be here at 61 feet is the first example I find, which is well below the criteria. Now, these can be plotted and they'll be color-coded in the GR4. according to the labels, the marginal, ideal, or inadequate. And then we'll have a visual representation of the paths in the network, excuse me, and whether or not we can use them. Obviously, we would not want to consider a path that has inadequate clearance. So I'll select these and I'll plot them. So they're selected, and we'll click on plot, and I'm going to select plot only sites in the design, and I will also show the clearance on the labels of the paths, and then plot. So this is the result in path loss, and you can see we have quite a few red lines and yellow lines, and the black lines, which there seems to be a lot fewer of them, are the ideal paths, the paths with better than 100 feet clearance. Now this is layered as the path layers were before, and I'll turn off the inadequates and marginals to show you only the ideals. Okay, so obviously this is not going to make a very good network. We have too many holes if we're only using ideals. So at this point we might want to consider looking at marginal paths. Before we go there, I'll show you the labels on the paths. I'll zoom in on one of the paths to show you. So here in the center you can see this black line is 140 feet of clearance. It's calculated with 18 gigahertz, and it's 2.69 miles in length. So very quickly you get an indication, and that's very useful if we're looking at marginal paths, which we will in a second, because then we can say, well, it's almost 100 feet, it's good. Okay, so here I've turned the layer back on for the marginal paths, and it pretty much completes the connections that we're missing. Now, ideally, we may find that we may not get the clearance we're looking for in order to complete a network, and then we might want to reconsider the antenna heights at specific sites to get more clearance. Specifically, I'll just zoom in on one to show you an example of what I'm talking about. So this one that comes across going upwards is 71 feet. We may want to consider in that case raising the antenna on that tower, or one end of the tower, or both, such that we get 100 feet in order to complete that specific link, because it looks like a very good link to have as part of a ring.